Good morning, everybody. The webinar will begin very shortly. We'll just wait a few moments for everybody to join. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, which is all about making data sharing in the public sector happen. I'm Siobhan Benita. I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, which serves civil servants here in the UK and all around the world. And also, I'd like to thank our knowledge partner today, which is SAS. So in terms of today's topic, public services can be revolutionised and personalised in the coming years. And better data sharing can unlock a real wealth of benefits and ultimately help to deliver better services to the public across that whole range of policy areas. So everything from healthcare and welfare right through to education and all of the areas in between. So in today's session, we're going to be covering issues like how governments can create the systems, the policies, but also establish the cultures to share data across their different organisational boundaries. And we're also going to talk about some of the practical ways in which individual departments, so where you're sitting maybe, can help make it easier for their data to be shared. We have a fantastic panel, 3 speakers with us here today, and in a moment I'm going to introduce our speakers, and they will all give some opening remarks. But there will also be an opportunity for you to put your questions to our great speakers, and we really would like you to maximise that opportunity. So somewhere on the device you're using, there should be a Q&A function. At any point from now on, please use that Q&A button to send in your questions. And before the end of the webinar, we'll get through as many of those questions. So in terms of our speakers today, first we will hear from Sue Bateman, who is the Interim Chief Data Officer at the Central Digital and Data Office. And this includes responsibility for the National Data Strategy and working with other bodies such as the Data Standards Authority, helping to drive a step change in the way government uses and shares data to transform services and decision-making capability. And Sue has previously spent a number of years working on IT and data policy and strategy in the Government Digital Service and other departments, including leading the international collaboration on the G8 Government Data Science Programme and partnerships. It's really great to have Sue with us here today. Then we will hear from Steve Burgess, who is Digital and Analytics Director, Public Sector for SAS UK, so our knowledge partner today, where his primary objective is to empower customers with cutting-edge insights and solutions and identify the path to data-driven decisions. In this role, it doesn't just mean providing technological solutions, but also helping to guide the people that he works with in how they leverage data and analytics to help make informed decisions. Having served in advisory capacities at Accenture and CSC, Steve brings a wealth of experience to the table. And alongside his professional role, Steve is an advisory board member for Home UK Start Trafford, where he helps them to deliver their digital strategy and their engagement plan. So ultimately using his knowledge and expertise to help families with young children through some really challenging times. And then last but not least, we will hear from Anna Bartlett-Avery, who is Head of Data Ethics and Data Sharing at the Welsh Government and public authorities to share, in particular, personal data to deliver public services that will benefit citizens. Most recently, this has included the response from the Welsh Government to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as supporting Wales as a nation of sanctuary, so the response to the war in Ukraine there. And I know we're going to hear more about those two examples from Anna in her opening remarks. So I'm sure you'll agree with me. We have three fantastic speakers with us here today. As I said, please do take this opportunity to message in your questions, and we'll do a good Q&A session once we've heard from our speakers. But without further ado, Sue, I'm going to come over to you and invite you to kick us off with your opening thoughts. You have to come off mute, Sue.
I know, I'm clearly not pressing hard enough. That's the second time this morning. Hopefully the last time, eh? Thanks, Siobhan, and morning, everybody. There's a couple of things I want to cover off in my opening remarks to get some questions and discussion going. So my interpretation of what does making data sharing across a little bit about what we've done so far, and then I think to again prompt some discussion, where do I think we need to go next in this journey that we're on? So on what does it mean to me? I think the starting point is really to remember that it's an enabler to something. It's not an outcome in itself. And I know that that might seem like a no-brainer, but there are times when I think we can get a little bit hung up on the data sharing aspect of it and not see, as you referenced, Siobhan, you know, these the great digital public services that we want to achieve, better decision making, better policies, better research, supporting the UK economy and improving all of our lives for the better. And within that, data needs to be at the heart of it. And so for me, it looks like we often talk about the right time, so data being delivered at the right time to the right place. I'd also add a third dimension to that of the right way. So thinking about the increasingly the ethical and trust dimensions of the right way. So what have we done so far? Well, as kind of a cross-government perspective, we've been guided by two strategies since 2020. So National Data Strategy Mission 3, and then the data component of the Digital and Data Roadmap. And those have focused on helping us set the foundations for making data sharing happen. So things like legislation, all the standards, all the frameworks, and the good practice, including skills and training that we need to make data sharing happen. And some of the things that pick out a few are things like a data ownership model for government for the first time, a data maturity assessment that is being rolled out across government again for the first time in a consistent way, and of course the data marketplace, our concept of a front door where organizations can come and find, understand, and ultimately reuse data. And the important thing to say about all of that is that it's been done with and for our community. And that's helping us to achieve the results that we have so far. We need to sustain that. We need to continue that work. But final I think, if we're going to really make data sharing happen across the public sector. And three quick things that I'd like to kind of put on the table for what I think are the step change. One is we need to view this not just as data. That by that I mean quite often when we're talking about data sharing, it's seen as an issue for the CDOs and their teams, or even the CDO opportunity as well as challenge. So it's a mindset shift. Coming with that is the way that we incentivize and fund how data sharing happens. So it's if we're breaking down the data sharing silos and walls that exist between organizations, we also need to to break down and rebuild the system that funds them. So we need to be thinking about those we want to achieve, and think about the funding and incentives in that way. And lastly, because I'm sure that we're going to touch on this today, we also need to think about the way that we currently see AI a bit differently. So lots of the conversations that I'm hearing kind of are pitching AI as something to be beholden because it's going to be the magic answer to everything, or something to be feared. And actually, it's no different context. AI, generative AI, whichever version you're describing, is also an enabler to something. And we need to recognise, though, that data and effective data use and data sharing is also an enabler to good use of AI. And so we need that conversation to be much richer and much more mature. So there's a few thoughts for you all, and I'm really looking.
Thank you. It's a perfect way to set the scene, I think, for our conversation. So I loved what you said at the start. Remember, data sharing is not an end in itself. It's an enabler to improving people's lives. So ultimately, that's why we are all thinking about this. And then you focused on kind of what's already been done. So those foundations in place, that strategy in place, things around who owns the data maturity, and then that concept of the data marketplace and having a front door where people can reuse data. And then looking ahead to that, as you called it, data sharing happen. So not seeing this anymore as just an issue for the data experts. This is an issue for everybody. I know in our audience, we have policymakers as well as specialists in our audience today, needing that mindset shift, breaking down some of those internal as well as what we're thinking about now with AI. Thanks so much. So a great way to set the scene. Steve, coming over to you.
Thank you, Siobhan. I want to talk a little bit about mindset, I think first of all. So we have a regular guest at several of our internal events at SAS, speaker. His name is Jamil, but Jamil is a performance coach and a psychologist. And one of the things that he often talks about is when we're seeking to drive change or improvement, within our personal or working lives, we should picture our end goal. So what is it that we're ultimately trying to achieve? And a great example he gave at one particular talk was as of a professional golfer at a major tournament. And he said that golfers typically mix with golfers, etc. But he told this particular golfer to break the cycle. So go and stand in groups, so go and stand with the number 1, 2, or 3 and engage with them like you're also the number 1 or 2, and put yourself, effectively in that mindset. And what that will do is make you consider your approach slightly differently. So instead of looking about, what's in front of you as barriers, what we're effectively thinking about is actually what are the opportunities that are in front of us. This will help us achieve our goals, but also transform, what we do today. I think in terms of making data sharing in the public sector happen and the barriers have taken to overcome them. So let's think about them as opportunities in front of us. But again, let's start with the end goal. And what we'll find is that we focus on the journey and the positive change. It was about 12 months ago when we had our last webinar on data sharing and why we're here today. And I think it's evidence that there's a huge amount of intent across government to make data sharing in the public sector happen. But I've not read the Office of Statistical Regulation report that was presented back in July 2023. It was labelled Data Sharing and Linkage for the Public Good. But within the executive summary, the top level statement, with data sharing and linkage in government, stands at a crossroads. So to help individuals and organisations within government explore the possible implications of choices they make now about whether to share or link data, they considered 4 possibilities for data sharing, and that was actually set 5 years from now. So I'm not going to use, well, I don't think it's right to use this time to discuss the 4 scenarios, but referring back to how we might approach this and taking all of these as learnings, we have to look at the base case scenario, which is data sharing and linkage for the public good. So interestingly, within here, the OSR set out that best case scenario, observing that data sharing and linkage is a priority, and many of the barriers identified in our report. And what they talk about is that this is achieved through high levels of collaboration among organisations within government, as well as strong partnerships with external researchers and organisations. And in this scenario, opportunities to enhance the public good of data and statistics are fully realised, and missed data use is very rare. So as Jamil and OSR both discuss the concepts of starting with goal, objective and endpoint, we have to talk about the opportunity that is presented when setting out the path to realisation, which I think we'll get to: systems, policies and cultures, using data to inform public services, and then practical steps for departments to enhance data usability. So yeah, just my perspective, I guess, Siobhan, in terms of that mindset, setting with the end game, but then equally thinking about the transformative steps along the way to address, what I think, are opportunities, not barriers.
Steve, thank you so much. So I really like bringing in kind of focus on the endpoint. I think that echoes what Sue was saying, that it's not, data sharing is not an end in itself. You need to think about why you're doing this, and ultimately you're doing it to improve people's lives. But as you said, then if you start with that endpoint, you see those what could be perceived as barriers as opportunities on the journey along the way, and how do you make the most of those opportunities and remove those what otherwise perceived as barriers. We can certainly share a link to Steve. You mentioned the Office of Statistics regulation report in the audience here, so they can look further at kind of the issues that you said. But again, I think as well, echoing a bit what Sue said in that report, saying we stand now at a crossroads in terms of the options that people have in front of them, and how we actually move forward now on this to really maximize those benefits of sharing data. And some of the things that you've raised, I think new issues that you've brought in, the importance of collaboration and partnerships, both across organizations in the public sector, but also, as you're saying, with private sector partners, with academia, for example, as well. Thanks, Stephen. As you say, we'll come back to what some of those opportunities are when we get into the conversation and into the Q&A. And just to say before our final speaker, please, any questions you've got, any comments, any thoughts, please start putting them in to the Q&A, and we'll get to those in a moment. But Anna, we're coming over to you now.
Thanks, Siobhan. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm really pleased to see so many people interested in this subject. It's something that's kind of dear to my heart, and something that my work focuses on every day. I'm going to say so, but hopefully some of what I say kind of reflects on what they've said. So data sharing and fostering a culture of data sharing for the benefit of citizens is a really key part of our digital strategy for Wales, and we have some long-standing commitments and supporting mechanisms that help us deliver that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I perceive the barriers are to the sharing of personal identifiable data, and some of these reflect across non-personal and aggregate and statistical data as well, and they're not unique. But for me, they boil down to 3 things really: culture, technology, and getting it wrong, the mythology that's arisen around what GDPR allows or doesn't allow, silo working, a high level of risk aversion in particular. Technology then, Sue kind of reflected on this a little bit. We have some very clunky methods of moving data around. We have incompatible data sets and systems, they don't talk to each other, and all of that can make sharing personal data really difficult. And then read the first two things, culture and technology, but the time and people that it takes to do this work can take a long time. It's not, I think as Sue mentioned, snap your fingers and it's done. It takes work, an ongoing work, to get this done, to make the data available, particularly if it's not compatible with a receiving system, and also to undertake the governance that sits around sharing personal data. None of these, though, are insurmountable, although I can completely understand why people think that they feel like they're enormous mountains to climb, ravines full of bear traps that you're going to fall into and get yourself into trouble. My work over the last few years focusing primarily on data sharing to support Welsh Government's response to the pandemic primarily, and then also our response to the war in Ukraine, has really highlighted for us the value of sharing personal data, but also how it's possible to overcome some of these barriers at pace while still protecting data subjects' rights. So I'm going to talk about these in brief. I'm happy to go into a bit more detail with questions if people want a bit more information. Really focused around sharing the data around those people who were more commonly known as shielding. So those individuals who were told that they are at serious risk and should remain at home and ideally not see anyone until things had improved. We needed to make sure that not only that the health system knew who those people were, because the information about who those people were and what meant that they were at such high risk sits within the NHS, but we need the forefront of providing services to those people, making sure that they got food, making sure they got medicines and all of the things that they needed to enable them to stay at home and keep themselves as safe as possible. And for the Ukraine, perhaps slightly less life-threatening, but we had the prospect of a large cohort of people fleeing the war in Ukraine coming to Wales and potentially finding themselves in really unsafe situations. So scheme, and the Welsh Government offered a scheme within a scheme, a super sponsor scheme, where we were supporting people. But for those people who were being hosted by a Welsh citizen, we needed to make sure that those situations were safe. And the people, again, at the forefront of making sure that that happened was our local authorities, and to an extent the NHS, who needed to conduct some health screenings and make sure that people weren't bringing in horrendous diseases into the UK. Within a really, really short period of time. Unlike the kind of what I said at the beginning, that this takes time, it is possible to do it quickly. Now, the circumstances of those two situations did help us here. The risk to life or the risk of harm does really sharpen the mind a little bit, but we can't rely on that all of the time. What was more helpful, I think, was that we have some underlying things that have been around in Wales for a while, our digital strategy and our commitments to those things. But we've had something in Wales for a while called the Wales Accord for the Sharing of Personal Information, colloquially known as WASPI, and please don't get that confused with the pensions inequality of people. This is a long-standing framework to which I think almost all public authorities, certainly devolved public authorities in Wales, are signed up to, that sits as a framework that gives templates and tools and an ethos of we will share data, help deliver the services to the public. It's a really helpful thing that gives us some consistency and some reliability in Wales, that if we use this, it covers everything. The ICO is quite comfortable with it, which is also helpful if you've got the ICO on board. What's also really helpful that we found to kind of overcome some of the fear and the resources issues is that if you can articulate the benefit, not yourself, not the organization that you're sharing with. If you can articulate the benefits to them or the risk to them if you don't share, that really helps people get over the line. We've found that, if you can say, if we don't do this, these people are at risk of these things, or they won't be able to access these things, or whatever it is. That also helps you think about what the safeguards need to be. So how do you limit the amount of data you move around? How do you limit the amount of times of it being lost or misused? But the key thing for us is that we work together. So again, we're going to have these long-standing relationships that sit within the Wales Accord for the sharing of personal information, but also our relationships with our local authorities, with our NHS colleagues, really help us kind of navigate some of those issues. That's a really hard thing to put in place. I completely appreciate that, but I think it reflects on some of what Stephen and Sue said, is that are really key to this. And I think just one final thing I would say is it's really important to keep it under review. So it's not a once and done. This is a cultural thing, something that you need to keep working on. If you are sharing data, are you regularly reviewing that it's working? If it's not working, why isn't it working? If it is working, can we make it better? And then how do we embed that into business as usual processes? And for me, I think that's the bit where we need to start thinking about, is how do we move away from this situational, prompted by something to have to move data around? How do we embed that culturally and strategically? Helpful. Thanks, Siobhan.
Brilliant. Yes, thank you, Anna. Really helpful. I mean, you ended there with how do we embed it into processes? I think where Sue ended as well, which is how do we make this culture shift now, this mindset shift, that this should be part of business as usual, that everybody is doing. But really interesting to hear how some of those, I mean, you set out nicely and succinctly some of those barriers, I think, around culture, technology and resources, but then kind of how you managed to overcome those in those two cases of the pandemic to the war in Ukraine, just showing, as you said, that if the urgency is there and other conditions are in place, this can be done. But how do we now make sure that this can be done in real non-crisis time? Flagging up there the importance of relationships. Again, I think mirroring what Steve said, the importance of collaboration and partnerships. You mentioned just a couple there. So, the NHS, local authorities working with the central government team. So really important to have those there. And then also some of the work you said about the foundation, but also the WASPI work that had been done, which was really helping to highlight the benefits of sharing data, remove maybe some of that fear around how people do this safely and securely. And I know you've all mentioned, I think, GDPR at some point. This is something that we might want to touch on in the questions, because I think a lot of people are so scared of what they can and can't share that I think that might be one of the biggest barriers that we have. Thank you to all of you. Fantastic opening comments there. And we have got some really good questions coming in. I just want immediately just you, Anna, on something specifically that you said. So Peter Wilson has asked, the COVID shielding data was supported by the Secretary of State, setting aside section 251. This is a bit technical. Were you able to share medical data for the Homes for Ukraine?
Yeah. To be clear, we weren't sharing medical data for Homes for Ukraine. What we were doing was sharing information about those people who were applying for visas under the Homes for Ukraine banner. Welsh government as a sponsor for their visa, or a Welsh. That information we received from Department for Levelling Up Housing, Communities and the Home Office. Actually, medical data was completely unnecessary. Whereas we didn't need it, not something that we wanted to get into. There was an element of, we needed to share data with the NHS about people because there is a significant TB risk. Why we shared with the NHS, but the information that then became generated around these people have had their screenings, they've registered with GPs, they've done all of that, sits exclusively with the NHS, and we get very, very little of it. because we don't have a lawful basis to have it, so we don't want it.
Yeah. Thanks, Anna. Great. Right, we're going to go to the very first question that came in was a general question, so I'm going to put this to all of you. And this came in from Julia, and I love this question because I think it goes to the heart of what you in particular were talking about, Sue, which is there a bit of a what's in it for me kind of culture? So for a department being asked to share their data, it's often deprioritized as something that's a hassle because maybe that department isn't getting the benefit. I think that's the summary here. So this Julia personally has spent the last 12 months trying to get a critical data feed from another government department. So how do we remedy this lack of motivation to engage? I think this goes to the heart of a lot of what you all said about the culture shift needed. Sue, I'm going to start with you because we haven't heard from you.
It's a great question. I'd also say it's a complex one, and that we need to be. I can feel the frustration coming out loud and clear, but I think we also need to appreciate where other organisations, i.e. the data holding organisations, might be, and it may not be necessarily the case. I don't know the specifics of this one, that it's kind of advertised, may just be that there are genuinely other pressures, given the context that everybody is in currently around funding and resources, that means, unfortunately, this kind of activity, which will ultimately, I believe, add the greater value for government as a whole, is not being prioritised. So that's kind of one thing that I think in all of this, all of the debate that we're to kind of move on from and see this as a whole of data holders and data acquirers working together, and so I'd go back to probably to the middle point as a starter around incentives and benefits, because on that I do agree a lot of the way that unless it's a program that is kind of being jointly set up and funded from the to make the case for organizations to deliver data that may not be providing them directly with a benefit, and so that is an area that I do think we need to do more work on, and part of that then is using examples like the ones that Anna has given, and got some similar experience on the kind of England UK side of the Vulnerable People Service, and those as to where the benefits are to help to change the mindsets in the system.
Thanks, Sue. Steve, I'm going to put the same question to you, but I want to add in as well, because I think it's so linked, Gareth's question. So Gareth Ricketts has said, in conversations with public sector contacts, there has been a generic understanding that data sharing could unlock huge benefits, but the issue is generally that each entity perceives they own the data. So this is very much what Sue was just saying. Is it possible to argue by the nation, therefore can be shared by all government agencies to improve delivery of government services? So it's this thing of who owns the data, how do you share it across? And Steve, I think you've been working, haven't you, with the ONS on the integrated data strategy. Does that help in this area at all?
Yeah, I think ownership or maintaining ownership, or understanding ownership from a sort of custodian perspective, that's the right word, in terms of the usage of that information towards its original intent and purpose, but then what might happen after that's what I see a lot of, and therefore the policy that sits around that in terms of either a memorandum of understanding or whatever that might be. And I think that's why we all get into that sort of perspective around, actually, I know the data, I'm not going to share that. Coming back to sort of what Sue talked about, and I went like that at the beginning when we on the sort of the opening bit for the last question, because literal behavior, cultures and behavior, and sort of, you know, recognition from a leadership perspective around the importance of why we're setting out what we're setting out to do in terms of data sharing, and therefore that being disseminated across the organization, and therefore being embedded in part sort of our role from a day-to-day perspective, you know, and recognizing that, yes, there are priorities, and yes, we can't just spend time sort of running around sort of meeting the wants and needs of others, because we're there to serve our own specific purpose. Again, I'm going to refer back to the OSR report, is that there is still, you know, and I talked about in terms of mindset, and let's not think of them as barriers but opportunities. There are still, you know, many barriers to before you can actually share a data asset. You know, with a respective partner, taking into consideration that policy, taking into consideration where it's going to sit, the protection and mechanisms around that, you know, whether it's desensitized, whether it's anonymized, how we understand its ongoing usage, and therefore the governance, not OSR, but the integrated data service, which has been established in order to facilitate and break down a lot of those barriers. I feel is a great mechanism and way by which the ONS have identified, you know, those respective challenges and have sought to broken those barriers down, and therefore facilitating, you know, ease of data sharing, which I think removes a huge barrier in terms of like, this is just too hard. Nobody's telling me I have to do it. I'm the data, and actually those hurdles that are in front of me, it's not a priority. So why should I? You know, there's lots of different things in there, isn't there? But
Yeah,
hopefully resonate and answer some of the question, maybe.
yeah. Thanks, Steve. Well, there's two questions coming which I think build on this. So Anna, I'm going to keep adding in questions to them, but I think they're all related. So following on from what Steve said there about you know, it might not be a priority for people. We just have to somehow help remove some of those barriers and make it easier. So create or provide easier access to data gateways between government departments and agencies. And then I'm going to throw in another one. So Anna, I'll come to you, but I'll come back to Sue and Steve on this last one. Is Mark has said, how can departments help others sharing data understand the relative priorities across a range of competing requests? So I think that goes back to your point, Anna, which is how do you actually communicate the benefits of doing this so that it becomes a priority for people? Anna, over to you. There's a lot of questions in there.
There's a lot of questions. That data gateways. So there is a set of data sharing powers within the Digital Economy Act, Part 5, which were designed to do exactly that, to make it easier to give a more flexible gateway that didn't rely on primary legislation, to allow public authorities to share data with each other for three primary sets of purposes when you come down to personal data in particular: improving the delivery and identifying and tackling debts. They're there, they exist. I think we know certainly in Welsh Government that perhaps they're not known well enough, and I'll let Sue comment on whether there's more to be done around those. But that set of gateways does exist. Maybe they're not flexible enough. Maybe it still takes too long to do it. I think that is still part of the problem, and something that we're looking at in Wales in our own devolved use of them is how do we make it as quick and as simple as possible. For this, I don't have an existing gateway. I can use the Digital Economy Act to do it. How do we make that quick and easy? Because that time issue, if it still takes you 18 months to do it, people move on, priorities change, money runs out, and all of these things mean it just simply doesn't happen. I just wanted to reflect a little bit too on this kind of data ownership piece, which is it's really difficult when you get into information about me. Is it mine? Is it the NHS's data? Is it DWP's data? Who owns it? And you know, I think that's partly what often scuppers people sometimes, is that ownership isn't clear. That means we then drift into kind of data ethics questions around, you know, are we being transparent and open and fair about what we're doing with the data that we've got? It all presents really difficult questions. I'm aware probably
people who own share it, so that they don't even know they are the people who own it and therefore can share it. So
and there's kind of public
as well.
perception of, but it's mine.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
we're talking about, does data become a national resource?
Yeah.
That's a really difficult line to tread when you're talking about
Yeah.
someone's health information, for example.
We've got loads of questions coming in, but Sue and Steve, I want to give you a chance to pick up on this. How do we kind of communicate to departments that this is a priority when they do have so many things going on and they've got so many competing issues at the moment? So Mark's question, how can we help departments to understand that data sharing is a priority for them?
Shall I come in
Yeah,
first?
thanks, Sue.
So I think this comes back to some of the stuff that I was saying up front around putting in place some of the practical tools that will help. Otherwise, we're forever talking in the abstract about this, because I do genuinely think that especially any person who's working in an organization that is kind of on any aspect of data delivery day to day, particularly those team members who are often at the kind of the front end in terms of drawing up those agreements. Everybody wants to do the right thing. Everybody recognizes that we need to shift the system, but actually the approach that we've taken then is looking at what are the component parts that are going to help to make that happen. So we've touched, without getting into the debate around what data ownership means, that the model that we've put in place and that we're rolling out with departments is more around, I think, Steve, you kind of described it nicely, is that concept of a custodian. Because regardless of whether we want to see assets more as something that is kind of in the description of national assets, you still need somebody to make sure that particular asset is being maintained, protected where it needs to, shared proportionately. I loved your kind of example, your answer, Anna, around we didn't share this in the Ukraine context because we didn't need that data. You know, there's a lot of stuff that we need to break down. So we see it as custodian. The kind of next step that we're working on with departments is the essential shared data assets. So this is putting at the heart of what data assets are already being shared across government that actually we believe have got a greater value than maybe their current use cases, and starting with the first 100 to 200 of those and building from that. But we have to build from something practical. So I guess part of my response to Mark is, I understand where you're coming from, but some of this, beyond the any of the kind of statements that we've made in things like the data sharing governance framework around presumption to sharing, has to come from demonstrating and managing the kind of practical implementation of that.
Thanks, Sue. Steve, did you want to add anything on this issue of the priority for a department to do this?
Yeah, would it be wrong of me to say that every department should have a KPI that points towards the making available of its data that delivers value as part of its ongoing measures? Would that change the mindset? Is that already there? Would it change the mindset? Would everyone go, absolutely not? It's not what we're here for.
I'm gonna post that back to Sue. Sue, is that already there? Do we measure kind of departments' willingness or the extent to which they already are making their data available?
Not currently, because there's no real central mechanism to do that without without adding a layer of bureaucracy on something. But actually, some of the once we've got the marketplace up and running as a service, there will be some metrics that are kind of integral into that. So we already know through things like the Digital Economy Act and the reporting that we get around the information sharing agreements, how much activity is going on in that space. That will form part of the marketplace going forwards. We already know through our work on APIs and our API register how many APIs are being exposed for reuse, and ultimately as we develop and onboard these essential shared data assets onto the marketplace, we will know through metrics the numbers of those data assets being made available. And also another clever process that we're building into the marketplace around facilitating data sharing. So we'll have a better understanding of how that is happening.
Okay, thanks, Sue. Well, I'm going to move on because we do. Yeah, sorry, Steve. Back to you.
It's fine. I guess the other bit is that sort of, for want of a better word, democratizing the benefit of sharing data. So therefore, as an organisation, you really get it. One, you understand, the value of it, but two, you understand where the benefit has been derived, and therefore the reasons or rationales to, why you should facilitate and support, a request.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Okay, lots of questions coming in. I want to take this one from Zoe, but I am conscious this might not be any of our speakers' kind of specialist area. So if you don't feel like you can answer this, then we will just move on. But Zoe Warwick has said, are there plans for patient portals to be available to all patients, which could contain social, mental health and medical data controlled by the patient, so governance issues on sharing are eliminated? So I think this is about, can a patient give permission for their data to be shared across a number of organisations? Anna from the Welsh Gazette, is this anything, do you know, can you add anything? Can you help Zoe on this question at all?
It's a difficult one, this, because actually I don't actually live in Wales, so I can't come at this from a patient perspective. I can come at it from an NHS England kind of perspective, in that there is the NHS app, and depending on your doctor's surgery, you have varying levels of data available to you. Now, my GP surgery seems to provide everything. I can see every test result, I can see everything they've recorded in a consultation, I can see every referral, every diagnosis, every piece of medication I've ever been prescribed. I can see all of that. I don't think that's universal. I think that is a surgery by surgery thing, and now that's really difficult. Whether that would overcome the governance issues, I'm not sure. It does on an individual level. If you've got a GP saying, I need to share your data with so and so, do you provide consent? Yeah, fine. I think it does. What it doesn't do is say, maybe take that data in a more aggregate way and say, we have got 40 patients here, all with the same condition, and we want to monitor the effectiveness of these treatments. Should we be relying on consent for that? I'm always torn between whether an individual patient should be able to take themselves out of that or not, when the societal benefit of understanding the impact of what the NHS does is so significant. I'm not sure that answers the question.
No, that's really interesting, though. I think, Steve, from your work, I don't think this is an area you focus, but are you aware of any kind of patient portals in the way that Zoe is talking about?
No, I'm not. I don't sit sort of in the healthcare space at all. But I mean, Anna, it's an interesting one that you've just described in relation to, my doctor. So my doctor has all the information in relation to my medical health history, and I can see that. I mean, an interesting concept around that would be a lineage piece, where effectively what you could then do within that portal, there's a policy that basically says you can grant or you don't grant access to that based on whatever necessity, proportionality that might be to facilitate whatever that might be, etc. But an interesting piece around that would be again, it's sort of, as mentioned, a sort of lineage in terms of, all right, yes, I've done that now, but can I see where my data has arrived?
Yeah.
And therefore, am I happy with that? And that speaks to, I guess, some of the again, the OSR report calls that out based on some of the feedback was about transparency, and openness in terms of where your data is going, and actually not after the fact, but before, and therefore stating the intent as to where this is going to arrive. So no, I haven't specifically, but I think the concept of it is quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. Sue, I do have a question specifically for you, but do you have anything to add on this portal? Okay. Well, I'm going to move on to the next. This came in from Patrick, Sue, and I think it's probably best answered by you. So Patrick says, I work in the shared services strategy for government, where we're working to define data standards for the back office of government, so in areas like HR and finance. How can we raise awareness of our work and encourage adoption of these standards? So Patrick is looking for some advice on how they can raise awareness of the work they're doing on standards in back office.
Great question, Patrick. So, and my team have been involved in, I think, supporting that work, certainly in the early phases of some of the kind of, how do we set up the right governance around this, and particularly around the identification and adoption of those data standards. So my first thing would be come to the DSA. You're very welcome to come to any of our communities and our review group to give an update on how that's going. It's an interesting one, because there will be some standards that are specific in the back office context, but I think there are also some standards, as we are discovering with another bunch of standards that we're working through with colleagues, that are not, they're just kind of common core attributes that need to be considered regardless of the data use. So I think that's also another way of raising that awareness, and maybe getting you more support for your program, is sometimes it can be easy to go, I'm working on this particular program that needs these data standards, and kind of not always make a connection that those data standards, those practices, some of the stuff that Steve and Anna have talked about, like assessment of risk, assessment of security, they're common across the board. It's just that sometimes, to make things more manageable as programs, we kind of lift, and actually the foundational stuff is there. So if you want to follow up, Patrick, you should find the Data Standards Authority on Gov.uk, and the address for contacting us will be there if you're not in touch already.
Thanks, Sue. And also another follow-up for Zoe. So Gareth has sent in and said, for Zoe, the Family Hub programme in DFE looked to address the issue of providing an individual's data relating to education, health, etc. So maybe, Zoe, if you want to have a look at what work was done under the Family Hub programme in DFE, you could do that. So moving on to our next question. Thank you. A couple of you have mentioned, so I think Sue and Anna, you've both mentioned a couple of times the Digital Economy Act. And a question in from Peter. So using the Digital Economy Act requires compliance with certain requirements. And he said mainly on consultation. Do you have processes in place to do these quickly? Anna, I'm going to come to you.
I guess it depends on what you mean by quickly. There is obviously a consultation requirement if you need new legislation, particularly, and we wouldn't seek to step outside of those. I think doing a consultation is a really, really key part of the process for us to understand, have we got it right? Is this going to work the way we think it's going to work? Have we captured all of the public bodies that we think need to be involved in something? Are there risks we haven't thought of? Are there issues and impacts we haven't thought of? consultation is a really, really big part of it. But we would seek to do it as quickly as we safely could, I think. Now, the Welsh Government requirement would normally be sort of 12 weeks for a consultation like this. That's still quicker, I think, than doing a full-on primary legislative data sharing gateway. It's still going to be quicker. It's not, and it's never going to be, I think, snap your fingers and the data starts moving, or I wish a gateway into existence. It just simply appears. It is going to take some time, and I think it's important that we recognize that part of the reason why it takes some time is that that's one of the key ways that you identify problems and issues. They tend to come out in the wash over a period of time. I could come up with great ideas of sharing data, but it's only somebody who knows the data better than I do, or knows the community that we're looking to serve, that might identify that's not going to work in the way you think it's going to, or that has unintended impacts. So I think time is important.
Thanks, Anna. So a bit of a word of caution about trying to do it too quickly. Sue, you were nodding there. Do you agree with what Anna said there?
Yeah, and I've got this is my chosen specialist subject since I took the legislation through in 2016, 2017. I'll try and answer the question, and I'll try and bring us into another aspect that we've not really touched on yet. I think we have a little bit, but we've been kind of thinking about this from a government context and how we make it better. So as Anna said, if you are looking to put in a new objective, then yes, we do need a public consultation for all the reasons that she set out. We have been learning the way of trying to do that more as quickly as possible. And what I'd say is, if any of you had identified the need for potentially a new objective under the public service delivery powers, a couple of things that we would ask for as a team is kind of your absolute commitment as policy leads and owners. And that might seem like a no-brainer, but knowing that the resource is there is one of the things that either speeds or delays the process. And the second thing that we have done now for the last couple of objectives that we've taken through, and for the ones that we've got in train, is not just think about it as an exercise in how do we get the legislation through Parliament, because there is an affirmative process to it, and we are at the mercy of parliamentary time, but in parallel to start the practical conversations between whoever's got the new objective that they need and the data holding, get out of ownership, organisations, to start to craft what the data flows look like. So by the point that we've done the consultation, we've been through Parliament, the legislation's been signed, sealed and delivered, and it's operational, we're trying to mitigate then the delay of kind of that being able to happen. So that's that. And then just, I suppose, to take it up a level though, and just picking up on Anna's point around why it is important. In a lot of this, we're talking about, can we join up? Quite sensitive, some of the questions have been in the space of healthcare data, and that is sensitive data, and even though we might think of we wouldn't on this webinar, but some people might think of data sharing as a dry subject, but actually the minute you start labeling with my medical data or my tax data or whatever, it becomes an emotional thing for people. And I think the really important thing, as both Anna and Steve have said, is kind of these concepts of transparency, trust and ethics as being integral in what we're doing. And so, I think the more that we want to even do kind of what is probably quite basic data sharing from some of the examples that have been given, through to adoption of AI, we do need to recognise that we need to get that license from our citizens, from maybe us over engineering on some of these things around privacy by design, but in a positive, constructive, guardrails way rather than an inhibitor, and equally around ethics by design as well.
Thanks, Sue. And that very comprehensive answer there leads us on nicely to a question that Graham has sent in, which I'm going to put to you first, Steve, but I will give Anna and Sue a chance to answer it as well. So Graham has said that he's seen a number of tools in recent years for organisations to help them assess the risks associated with sharing data sets. How should we, as in civil servants, be assuring organisations that data is being shared responsibly? I think this goes exactly to what you were just saying there, Sue. Steve, your thoughts on how can we give assurance to people and to organisations that data is being shared responsibly?
I mean, assurance is built, one, against process, I guess, two, against transparency, but fundamentally on top of trust. I think there's got to be an inherent trust, within, from our citizens towards our government in relation to how the data is going to be used and what it's fundamentally going to be used for.
Yeah.
And coming back around to the sort of the transparency aspect of that, I'm not sure whether we provide assurance through transparency. I think we do, but having sufficient, and the word tooling was mentioned, I think, at the beginning of that, having or being able to facilitate that, through the ability to, almost going back to the patient scenario before, a system that allows us to see source and destination and all the relevant steps in between would provide that level of assurance. Without that, we're back to policy, aren't we, in terms of its intent, its purpose, its necessity, its proportionality in terms of where it's going to be used and why and to what extent. I'm not sure I have a definitive answer, if I'm being honest with you. I'm just thinking about some of the points around it, really.
Yeah.
As to what might contribute to assurance to that extent.
I mean, I think that's good. You've put in a lot there. So, like, how do you provide assurance through process and the right systems, but also trust and transparency? I think really nice way to summarize it. Anna, I'm going to throw this over to you, because obviously the other part, we're focusing on data sharing. The other part of your job is data ethics. So I guess this kind of covers both of those, but your thoughts on that assurance around data being shared responsibly?
So, I mean, just to echo what Steve said, transparency is a massive part of data ethics. Also accountability and also fairness. There are many tools available, some provided by UK government, that are really helpful in getting you to understand and assess the ethical implications of what you do. And those include, if you're using personal data, a requirement to consider GDPR and any of the other legislation that governs how you use data. One of the things we come back to in Welsh Government a lot is that just because it's legal doesn't necessarily mean it's ethical, doesn't necessarily mean that it's fair. And I think, and I would echo what Steve said to an extent, that transparency is where it all begins. So the more we're open and honest with the public about what we're doing with data, how it's used, and the outcomes of that, the more you build trust. I mean, there's always going to be people that don't like us doing things with data and don't agree or think that they should be able to consent to something that they can't. But for me, it comes back to we need to be more open with the public about what we're doing, and actually partly more honest about where it doesn't work. Because I think, it's very easy to say we've done all of this stuff and isn't it great, but we've done all of this stuff and actually it doesn't work, or we encountered XYZ problem. That goes to building trust as well, I think.
Thanks, Anna. Sue, anything to add on the assurance of how it's being shared responsibly?
Yeah, so I think three things. So one, test; two, engage; and three, communicate. So test your assumptions around the design that you have, and do that by engaging. So I've got experience of where we've gone directly to the Information Commissioner's office on some complex and challenging data sharing, and tested our assumptions and engaged with them from the off, and that proved useful when some stories hit the media and the ICO were asked for a comment, and they gave very positive comments because they've been engaged. You know, sometimes there's a little bit of fear of doing things behind closed doors and doing things within a certain group, but test those. And then communication, as Stephen, Anna have said, and it can be simple things like blog posts. It can be simple things like coming along to a session like this and, you know, learn about some of the work that's happening in the Welsh Government. Those are quite simple things that are actually being open and transparent, over and above the DPIAs that organisations do that aren't always the most accessible. So thinking about making your transparency accessible to people as well, and it, as I say, it can be really simple things like blog posts or like events like this are ones that kind of are even more public facing, that just builds up that, you know, we're not doing things behind closed doors, and we are doing things in a responsible way.
Thanks, Sue. We are almost out of time. Thank you so much to the audience. You've sent in loads of fantastic questions. The final question I want to put to all of you, and we'll have to probably keep the answers quite short though, is Sue, you did mention a couple of times AI, and I think Steve, you mentioned that as well. And I want to bring everything right up to kind of very topical. And the question is quite a simple one really, which is, do you think the kind of I would say there's so much focus on AI now, and it's certainly something that ministers are very kind of engaged in at the moment. Do you think this is going to be a force for good in terms of kind of speeding up good data sharing? Because actually some of the use of generative AI is going to require really good data sharing. So is AI going to actually be a force for good and speed up some of what we are talking about today? Steve, I'll start with you, your thoughts on that.
Has to be a force for good, right? You know, I think if you look at the productivity, the efficiency, the gains that we get through the use of transformative technology, is absolutely a force. You know, we're absolutely moving in the right direction, but you know, like everything, there's always a trade-off, isn't there? We have to balance those trade-offs with risks, or we have to balance those trade-offs and understand the risk even more so. And obviously, you know, data privacy to that extent. I mean, if I just look at, we've talked about where is my data going? How am I going to use my data? Would you be happy if some researcher was effectively accessed your information, your data through a large language model to decipher information? Do you sign up for that, or do you not? What, you know, maybe in a policing context, using, you know, we talk about generative AI because that is the buzzword at the moment, you know, a computer vision image that identified you as an individual, but then for some reason linked you to a criminal organization, and all of a sudden you're in this catchment. Is that right? You know, to that extent. We could spend an hour on this subject.
The next webinar. This will be our next webinar.
Go on, but absolutely, we've just got to move forward in the right direction with the right policy, the right understanding of, you know, what it is we're trying to achieve, understanding the trade-offs and therefore the associated risks, but ultimately the better use of data and emerging technologies to support, you know, citizen experience, managing risk and effectively moving forward. Absolutely. Sorry.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, maybe it's a bit mean of me to put this as the last question and ask everyone to answer quickly.
Sorry.
Anna, I'm going to come to you and then Sue, but just quickly, just to say thanks to Gareth, who's just messaged in to say great session. Big thanks to all the speakers, and I echo that. You've all been fantastic. But Anna, very quickly, your thoughts on AI and data sharing.
I think I agree with Steve. I think it has enormous power to transform all of this. I think it also presents us with enormous risk. And we've got to be really careful that we take the public with us on it. There's no point doing it unto them, because then you just realize all of the risks inherent in it. It presents enormous challenges, but I think there's a real opportunity here. Yeah. And to get, you know, an understanding of how much data underpins everything we do. I think AI is starting to show that in a way that perhaps wasn't so clear before. Yeah, risks and challenges, but yeah, I would see it as a force for good, hopefully.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anna. Sue, we started with you. We're going to end with you. So are you going to leave us on a positive note when it comes to this?
Yes, I am. So I was asked this question in December, and I said that I was cautiously optimistic because I wasn't sure that the connection between data and AI had been kind of that had landed. I'm now more optimistic. I do think that decision makers are understanding the need for good quality data as a foundational component for AI. And so yes, I think it can be a force for good. What I'd say though for any colleagues who are in the data space is keep pushing on with the work that you're doing, because that is going to be the thing that unlocks the potential of AI for us across the public sector.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Sue. So a nice positive note to end on, but also a call to action that we can't, as I think Anna said as well, we've got to keep this under review and keep working on all of this. Thank you so much to Sue, to Steve, and to Anna. Julia has just messaged in saying, really interesting, great conversation. I want to echo that. Thank you to all of our speakers for giving us your time and your expertise. And I think that may be the most number of questions and answers we've got through in any webinar that I've ever done. So thank you for giving really nice succinct answers as well. Thanks to SAS for being our knowledge partner for today.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Steve. It's always great to have you on. And to the audience, thank you again. Great questions coming in. And we will have sent you, I think, a short questionnaire. If you get a few moments to fill that in, just to make sure we keep giving you the webinars that are of most use and interest to you, that would be hugely helpful for us. So thank you from me in advance. And also, you'll just see we've put up on the screen there a couple of things to draw your attention to. So this webinar is actually the first in kind of a series of events that will be running up to an in-person event, Public Service Data Live, which we'll be holding in London in September this year. It's our annual event for anybody who's interested in kind of all things data, especially in the UK, but we may have speakers coming in from elsewhere as well. So please do look on the website for more information on that, and you can already submit your interest there through the link. We'll send all of this to you after as well. And then also just to let you know as well about a training opportunity that we have. We're running a new series of training seminars all on the subjects of data and AI, which we just ended on over the coming months. The first one of these will take place on the 29th of February on the subject of how artificial intelligence can empower the civil service. Going to give a real good overview of AI, and there'll be live demonstrations, group activities. And also on that one, I think Kevin Cunnington, who was formerly the Director General of the UK's Government Digital Service, will be presenting there. So he will be lending his expertise to that one. So you can get full details of that as well on that link there, and we'll send you that information as well. We will send to everybody who registered today and everyone who attended a recording of today's conversation. You can watch it all again, share it with colleagues who you think might be interested, and there will be an article covering the key points from today's session that will come around in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks again to our great panel. Thanks to all of you for being here today, and I hope we see you again very soon on another one of our webinars. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye from me for now. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.